This is part 1 of Unit 6. As you can see here, it's entitled The Coming Crisis. In other words, what we're studying here is the culmination of the events that are leading up to the outbreak of the war. So the crisis is coming. We're going to study the decade or so in chapter 15 that really kind of illustrates these divisions getting even worse and leading to ultimately the Civil War. Sectionalism, that idea that different regions of the country were kind of dividing themselves because each region was different. They had different economic concerns, different belief systems, these kinds of things. That sectionalism, that idea we've been talking about, was really, really growing. And it had been growing for a long, long time. We've been studying the things that have been splitting the nation apart. And you can see it was splitting the nation primarily between North and South. But it wasn't just splitting the country in terms of geography, it was also splitting up our political parties at the time. The two main political ones were the Democrats, going all the way back to Thomas Jefferson's Democrats and the Jacksonian Democrats, and then the newly formed party that was the Whigs that started to form after Jackson was elected president. These parties were dividing as well, splitting up, and oftentimes it was over the issue of slavery. And the big issue is slavery in the territories. That is what is driving everything here in the 1850s, is lots and lots of people are against slavery, but they really don't want to see it going into the new territories. And the South, of course, is always trying to expand slavery to help it defend it ultimately. So that's what's really dividing it. So the country's dividing geographically, but so are the political party and really communities in general. How do we are we against slavery altogether? Are we just against slavery expanding? Or are we for slavery or somewhere in between? That's kind of what's happening all over the country. People are sort of all over the roadmap because you have a big contingency of people like Garrison who say slavery needs to be abolished and abolished immediately right now. Other people are going to say, well, slavery is we can't take it away because our country depends on it, but I don't want to see it growing. And then, of course, some people are saying other things as well, kind of in between. That's what we're talking about. Everything that was coming up for discussion during this time always seemed to revert back to North versus South, or to slavery. Basically North versus South more than anything. Okay, it get to the point, I think I mentioned this in class already, it got to the point where basically if someone in the North said black, someone in the South had to say white, just to be different, because we can't agree on anything. You're a Yankee or you're, this or that. I can't agree with anything. And that's really the bulk of the discussions that are going on during the 1850s, kind of just are getting into this deadlock where I just don't like you and I can't agree with you no matter what. And that's really what we're talking about. What ends up happening is both sides kind of develop a negative stereotype of the other. The South was kind of seen as backwards, illiterate, not as developed, not as sophisticated, not as cultured. Immoral. They're brutal slave masters that really don't understand right and wrong, and their version of Christianity is warped or perverted. And they're aristocrats. They're a little, nose stuck up in the air. They think they're better than us. They think, they're a little hoity-toity, those kinds of things. That's the prevailing stereotype of the South. The North was seen as hypocrites. Again, remember the South said, you have slaves, you just call them workers in your factories. And that they simply didn't understand that slavery was necessary. They just didn't, they just don't get it. Sometimes you hear people say that today, somebody just doesn't get it. That's what the South thought of the North. The North was just hypocritical. You had slaves at one time and now you don't need them, so it's okay for you to get rid of them, but we still do. We still need slaves. Our whole life depends on it. You just don't get it. You just don't understand. And they kind of saw the North too as kind of just money grubbing people that just kind of thought their way of life was the best and didn't mind pushing it on someone else, their ideas or beliefs. Anyway, the important part to remember is when you see stereotypes develop, that's when real communication is broken down, and you're on the verge of something bad because they have these negative views of each other, and that just kind of is a telltale sign that bad clouds are on the horizon. as it happened many times before, there are disagreements or controversies about what to do with slavery, especially in the territories. Remember, it's always about the territories. So in 1850, after the war with Mexico, as it happened in the past, there was a compromise forged out. We have Clay, known as the Great Compromiser, again, kind of leading a charge. He has Calhoun from the south, Webster from the north, these three great men that have been in the Congress for a long time, kind of one more time try to forge a settlement to kind of put off war. But you can see here as the board, this is just a temporary solution. The problem is only getting worse and worse and worse, and instead of dealing with it, they're still just trying to put band-aids on it just to kind of hold it together. They don't want to deal with it once and for all. Here are the main parts to know about the Compromise of 1850. California is going to be admitted as a free state. Slave trade in Washington, D.C. is going to be abolished. No more selling of Africans in the nation's capital. But still, notice that still they can have slavery there, but just no slave trade. 3, there's going to be a stronger fugitive slave law. In other words, if slaves run away to the North now is required to help return them and help people in the South recover the slaves or the property, as they would say it. And then there's a few other parts of it, but like it fixes the border between the United States and Mexico. But really, these are the 3 that are the most important. Okay. Again, the common theme here is the question of slavery in the territories, which is the big one. As our country grows and expands, is slavery going to grow with it? Many people were just dead set against that, and of course the South insisted on it. That concept really wasn't addressed. It wasn't addressed fully. It's basically going to be as a need basis. When a new territory comes along and it applies for statehood, we'll decide that question then. There's no real, definitive answer like this is how we're going to handle this from now on. No, it's just kind of, we'll just deal with it. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. It's probably the best way. Okay, and so as you can see from the bottom of the slide here, it wasn't long then until the compromise started to fail and fall apart because they never really dealt with the underlying issue. They just, kind of put a nice package together. And it kind of calmed everybody down for a while, but everybody was still had all these deep feelings underneath, so it's not going to last a whole long. And so the next couple of slides here are just going to talk about how that crisis comes apart. One of the things that's kind of interesting, and you wouldn't think this, but one of the biggest reasons that the compromise starts to unravel quickly is the new fugitive slave law. Slave owners in the South, of course, had a great investment in slaves. Slaves were expensive, and then they run away to the North when they couldn't reclaim that property. And that was a big loss financially to them. And so one of the things they got in the compromise that they really wanted was this fugitive slave clause, which meant people in the North were bound to help find runaway slaves and to return them once they were found out. So if I was in the North and I didn't help slave catchers, I could go to prison or I could get a fine. If I was in the North and I was asked to help catch a runaway slave and I didn't, I could go to prison or pay a fine. There would be consequences for that. And so that was kind of a big deal because, of course, the people in the North don't, for the most part, want to have anything to do with that. But now they're required by law to do that. And it led to a lot of problems. And in your book is a section that talks about one such instance revolving a man named Anthony Burns, who was living in the North and was found out, and then he had to return. And basically that caused a huge commotion in the town as they marched him through the town to the ship that was going to return him. Stores were closed, people were dressed in black, store windows were draped in black as if someone had died. So this was a big deal, and it just kind of shows how the North is really against this or this fugitive slave clause. They really don't like it, but they're forced to go along with it, and that's of course going to create a lot of hard feelings and resentments as well. Bleeding Kansas is another good example of the compromise eroding. Kansas, Nebraska was a new territory. And again, the old question, is it going to be slave or free? The idea was put forth that we should let the people in the territories themselves decide. When it becomes time for them to become a state, we'll have a vote. We'll let the people decide if they want to have slavery or not. And that's the idea of popular sovereignty that I have underlined here. That was the kind of the latest option that they were giving people. Instead of the government saying this is a free state or a slave state, we'll let the people decide. Well, what this ended up doing then is it touched off a powder keg, because then there was a race to see who could get more people into Kansas or Nebraska. Of course, people from the South were encouraged to go relocate there so that they could eventually vote for slavery, and abolitionists from the North rushed to the new territory to deny slavery. And this led to some actually fighting between different towns and different groups of people in the territories, where they actually started fighting each other because they were trying to scare the abolitionists off or get rid of the southern slaveholders. They actually fought. That's why it's called Bleeding Kansas. There was actually gunshots and people died during these skirmishes because they were trying to get rid of the other side so that I'd have more people when it came time to vote. And this, of course, was very controversial in the states as well, around the country, because both sides did horrible things in this. This is where we're going to first learn about a guy named John Brown. You might remember the preacher Beecher and his daughter, Harriet Beecher Stowe, that wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. He and a lot of his followers went there, and Beecher Bullets, they were called, when they were passing out Bibles trying to convince everybody that slavery is wrong, and they participated in some of this as well, especially John Brown and his sons. And so Bleeding Kansas, if you ever come across, that's just referring to this time when the settlers in Kansas and Nebraska territories were fighting amongst themselves, killing each other off because they were trying to either get rid of slavery or keep slavery. And that, of course, shows that this compromise is not really working. It's not solving the problems. We're still having the same issues as before, and it's getting kind of ugly now. It's getting violent. It's getting messy. Okay, and again, that was called Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas, this fight. When this happens, anytime you have a violent act like this and people die, it just causes people to get off the fence post. They can't ignore the problem anymore. They have to choose sides. And so when this happens, this further divides the country even more. More and more people are brought into the conflict. Now it's not just a few people in the North that want slavery abolished and the slave owners in the South. Now it's more mainstream people, more and more people, the people on the corner, the people that haven't really thought about it anymore. But now they're getting to the point where all the time there's things in the news, and when you see Americans killing Americans, they just basically get to the point, we got to do something. We got to get rid of this. This is ridiculous. We can't do this. And of course, it just brings more people into the fray. And as you can see here, it's going to lead to the formation of a new party, the Republican Party. And the Republican Party, again, one of the things I tried to get you to remember last unit was at first an anti-slavery party. And a lot of that is going to be they're very much against slavery expanding into the territories. That's going to be their primary position or stance. Not necessarily against slavery per se, although there are some Republicans who are, but mostly just against slavery into the territories. Another interesting little side story here that shows the crisis eroding is the attack of Charles Sumner in the Senate. And this is in your book as well, and it's kind of interesting. But this fighting got so bad in the Senate that the senators, the people who are supposed to be our leaders and set an example, were actually fighting in the Senate. Sumner got hit over the head with a cane and became, almost crippled because of the discussions going on. So when anybody was saying things anti-Southern or anti-Northern, things got pretty heated, pretty atrocious, and people said a lot of nasty things against each other, and it got to the point where actually violence broke out in the United States Senate, so much so that people started carrying sidearms. They started carrying guns into the Senate and to the House of Representatives to defend themselves in case things got out of hand. So you can see this is just escalating, and it's getting to the point where, talking isn't going to be enough. It's going to be more than talk that's needed to solve this. Probably the thing that tipped us over the edge more than anything is the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was a slave, a former slave who moved to the north with his master, and in the north where he was, there was no slavery, of course, so then he said, I'm free. And his case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and he lost. And the key thing here is the Supreme Court said that black people are not people, they're property. And so just like a desk or a house or a piece of land, when the master dies, cannot just get up and walk away and be free. People are property too, in this case the slaves. And so he basically said that slaves are property, and this kind of was the last straw for abolitionists, because they thought, well, the government basically has said now that these people are property and there's nothing we can do to stop that, and that slavery is just going to continue and continue. And that pushes this guy John Brown over the edge. And John Brown is a very passionate abolitionist, and he wants to end slavery at all costs. And so he leads a raid on Harper's Ferry, which is in Virginia, or in that about parts anyway. It's Pennsylvania, I think is where it is, but those all kind of come together. He leads a raid on a munitions factory where they make guns and weapons at Harper's Ferry. That's where they make the weapons for the United States Army, and they had a bunch of them there as well. And so he was going to capture these guns and ammunition, and then distribute them down south and rally people to his cause and start a huge slave revolt. And this didn't turn out so well. He was captured, put on trial, and the trial makes John Brown a hero, and he ends up being hung, and he turns into a martyr. And this really scared the heck out of the South, because the South saw how many people were against the North during this trial and how John Brown became a hero to them, and that kind of scared them to the fact that we're really, these people really hate us and they're really against us, and there's nothing that we can do to really prevent that. It's just kind of the handwriting's on the wall, so to speak. We know where this is headed. These people are relentless. They're never going to stop, and we can't trust them, and so we need to break away. So after John Brown's raid, people in the country are really up in arms about slavery and really passionate one side or the other. There's not a lot of middle ground anymore. There's a lot of people that are angry and frustrated, and insults and shots go back and forth, so to speak. So the country is really teetering on the brink after John Brown's raid. And remember, it makes him a martyr, and to the people in the South, that's a very scary deal. And that takes us to the election of 1860, which is kind of the big event that we've been leading to, more or less. In your book on page 516, there's a map that shows how the election was broke down, and you can see the real winner really is sectionalism. Okay, just shows how the country really was divided. The South all voting for the Democrats and so forth. What ends up happening is, because the vote is kind of split, and it's not just two parties kind of going there. You can see that on the map. The Republicans, and that's Abraham Lincoln, victory meant due from the South. Remember, Lincoln had said many times that, and the Republicans stood for this, that they were really against slavery in the territories. Lincoln basically said, if I can keep the nation together by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could keep the nation together by freeing none of the slaves, I would do that. If I could do it by freeing some and not others, I would do that. So he's not really anti-slavery, but that's what the South thinks. And when the Republicans win, the South basically says our way of life is at an end. We'll never be able to keep it with this guy as president. He's anti-slavery. The country's moving in that direction. So what I'm saying is the election of Lincoln is the final straw for the South. They basically say there's no way we can keep our way of life anymore. We're just fighting an uphill battle. We're eventually going to lose. The only recourse then is to leave. Okay? And so South Carolina becomes the first state to secede, and they're very, very excited about this. People in the South had been waiting for this day, and they're off, in celebration when South Carolina does this. There's parades, there's parties, there's, fireworks. People are just generally jubilant. They think they're going to whoop the North's butt in a very easy, quick way, and they're very, very excited about the war. The issue for the South, and there are other states that follow immediately after South Carolina, the issue was not slavery, but really states' rights. That states had the right to make their own laws and live the way they wanted to, and not be pushed and bullied around by the central government or anyone else, and that's kind of what they sought. They really are primarily fighting for their way of life. If you were to interview most Southern soldiers, they're fighting because they want to live the way they want to. They don't want to be forced to change. And it's not necessarily that they think their way of life is the best, but it's just like you and I. We don't like to be told what to do. Now, slavery was just the main thing that kind of brought this on, but it was really the Southern states felt they were being forced to change, and they shouldn't have to. They can live the way they want to, and that was really the issue. They formed their own government called the Confederate States of America. There's going to be 11 states that are in this initially, and Jefferson Davis will be their first president. He's a graduate of West Point. He has military experience, and their capital is going to be Richmond, Virginia. So the new government is formed under Jefferson Davis, and they have a cabinet just like we do, and they elect their leaders and pick them, and they're setting up government. And their hope is, by doing this all, their hope that the North will just let them go. Their hope is that they'll just be let to leave, and there'll be no stink about it. That's kind of what their hope is. So that's kind of setting the stage here for the war. You can see the last little bit here on the slide is that Lincoln arrives in Washington, D.C. under the cover of darkness because his life was in great danger. There were threats against his life already. And he had to go through Maryland. Maryland is a border state, could go either way. They had a lot of sympathy towards the South, however, and so he had to go through there, and he actually had to kind of have a double and put on a disguise in essence to get into D.C. Whether there was a real imminent threat or just people making threats is hard to see, but he does feel there's a threat, so he comes kind of sneaking in under the cover of darkness, and people are wondering if this guy is even going to make it, if he's going to survive, and certainly whether he's qualified or not to lead us through this great crisis. And so that is the end of part 1 of Unit 6, and we'll continue with the actual war then in part 2.